Welcome to Overcoming Physician Burnout as Health Architects, a series in which we talk about different ways that physicians can approach their clinical work to make it more rewarding and fulfilling. This is Venkatesh Ramnath, and today is episode 7. What happens when we and others don't have a scientific attitude? For your information and interest, if you prefer reading, I would invite you to take a look at the written post which accompanies this audio version and also has embedded links for the references that I include. Now, in previous episodes, I described what a scientific attitude is, when we balance solid evidence with the flexibility to update knowledge, and I emphasized its importance. So let's say you take the plunge, but you see others around you who don't play by the same rules. What do you do when that happens? Avoidance isn't the best medicine. At first, avoiding conflict might seem like the easiest path. One of my friends, who is an obstetrics gynecology physician on the East Coast, told me that some of her colleagues prefer to look the other way and go with the flow when faced with decisions by colleagues who don't follow the evidence. But she and I agreed that unresolved tension always festers and seeks an outlet. We vent to nurses, we vent to other staff, we vent to peers, a practice ingrained since internship. We vent to our spouses, and we even vent to ourselves in our minds. Some go further and document passive-aggressive notes in patient charts, only to be warned against chart wars by administrators and hospital lawyers who worry about malpractice fallout. Heck, sometimes we even vent to patients. I remember many times in the past when I blurted out my complaints about others when exasperated patients and families pressed me for answers about why antibiotics were stopped or why surgery was delayed in a vain attempt to defend my actions. But most of the time, we aren't even aware of venting or the harm it causes. I certainly wasn't. On the other hand, what about direct confrontation with someone who isn't practicing a scientific attitude? This can be just as disastrous if handled poorly. And I know this firsthand, as I will relate next. Showdown in the ICU. I once had a fiery clash with another physician in a Northern California ICU a few years after I finished my training. A nephrologist insisted on immediate dialysis for a septic patient based on his experience. I disagreed based on mine. Neither of us recalled the data that could have settled the dispute, like one study demonstrating that delaying the onset of dialysis had no observable harm. After several minutes of arguing, increasingly realizing we were locked in an impasse, I finally pulled rank as the attending of record. No dialysis. He stormed off. I had won, but when I looked around and saw the nurses' awkward expressions around me, I realized I'd also lost. My embarrassment and the tension in the ICU clung to me like wet clothes for days. As a result, I learned the hard way that I needed a smarter way to handle the differences in clinical opinion. As a health architect, I learned to navigate these situations differently. I found that with a scientific attitude and some better communication techniques, which I'll talk about more in a later post, I could retain my sense of agency and even enhance my sense of human connection in the process. Reaping the benefits as a health architect. Let's fast forward. Several years later, in a Midwestern ICU in the dead of winter, I was managing a 26-year-old man with HIV/AIDS and severe respiratory failure from pneumocystis pneumonia. I adjusted the ventilator settings based on decades of research on acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. But the covering physician, Aaron, later changed everything, contradicting the evidence. At first, I let it slide, but when it happened again, I saw an opportunity. Instead of getting defensive like I'd been with the nephrologist years before, I initiated a conversation about the evidence in ARDS. Aaron was skeptical, arguing that the studies were flawed and his intuition worked just fine. He even told me at one point, things either work or they don't. I remember being taken aback by the degree of his cynicism. Our conversation was intense and heated at times, but we found some points of agreement. We both agreed that evidence from well-designed trials was still stronger than a pure trial and error method. Furthermore, we agreed that we shouldn't be rash in adopting new theories and therapies Time is needed to verify or falsify the evidence. Restraint is especially warranted when new evidence breaks with conventional understanding. That said, anecdotal experience is always fragile when it comes to reliability and reproducibility. We eventually found a middle ground. While evidence isn't perfect, it's far more reliable than gut instinct and anecdotes alone. Lessons from the past. Aaron's skepticism mirrored that of 19th century doctors who clung to bloodletting and elixirs not out of malice, but out of desperation. Without reliable evidence, they filled the gaps with stories of supposed successes, even when deep down they must have known that the truth was shakier than they admitted. Even then, however, there were pioneers like William Osler who took a different path. Osler prioritized probability over possibility. See my earlier post, demanding rigorous evidence over personal anecdotes. His refusal to prescribe unproven remedies even earned him the label of therapeutic nihilist, a badge of honor in hindsight, but a controversial stance at the time. But you don't have to look back 2 centuries to see what happens when medicine leans on anecdotes instead of evidence. The early days of the COVID pandemic played out the same script in 2020. Treatments like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, convalescent plasma, and high-dose vitamins were ordered left and right, not because they worked, but because physicians desperately wanted them to. At best, these distractions diverted their attention from established medical knowledge. At worst, they cost lives, like when some misinterpreted COVID-related ARDS, urging doctors not to intubate critically ill patients. This wasn't a failure of medicine, it was a failure to trust what we already knew. Many forgot that we weren't operating in the dark. We had decades of research on respiratory viruses, from influenza, including variants like H1N1 and the current H5N1, to SARS-CoV-1, to Middle East respiratory virus CoV, to respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, to others. Yes, COVID, also known as SARS-CoV-2, was new, but the principles of virology, immune response, and vaccine development were not. That's why science delivered a vaccine in record time when the world needed it most. History proves over and over that evidence-based medicine isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Without it, we're just guessing. Battling burnout with a scientific attitude. But I digress. Let's go back to my experience with Aaron to see how being a health architect with a scientific attitude improved my sense of agency and connection, 2 core drivers behind burnout. First, my commitment to a scientific attitude and the evidence encouraged me to revisit the latest research, challenge my biases, and sharpen my medical knowledge. In doing so, I bolstered my confidence and sense of control about what constituted best practice medicine, not just what I thought it was. Second, I felt more connected to others around me at the bedside. Aaron and I weren't best friends, and we didn't always agree, but we had a stronger relationship by the end of our week working together. The discussion about evidence made our conversations about what to do more of an objective assessment of facts and less of a personal attack. And while our practice styles still differed, our approaches to the ventilator generally became more aligned, as if by an invisible force. Meanwhile, others noticed. This gave me an additional stream of positive feedback. The respiratory therapist appreciated not having workload whiplash from my and Aaron's constantly contradicting orders. The nurses were more at ease with me when they explained that the patient's oxygen levels buckled less with fewer ventilator changes. The tone of family members' questions softened as they seemed less fixated on why plans kept changing, which I had previously interpreted as an underhanded way to figure out which doctor they trusted more. I even noticed fewer requests to talk to administrators because there were fewer complaints. The notion that doctors' disagreements are always private and insulated from others' workflows and well-being is a myth. Moving closer to the evidence brought a higher consistency and calm to the ICU as a whole, a win for everyone. Most important, my 360-degree connection with others was viscerally calming and palpably different from what I experienced for so many years. Being a health architect just felt better when I was at the bedside and working with others, and that buoyancy persisted long after I finished my shift. A closing note. When we signed out to each other on the last day, I asked for Aaron's number to stay in touch. He said, "You want to call me? Why? So we can argue more?" But as I punched in the digits on my phone, the smirk on his face told me that he kind of hoped that I would. Take home point. Adopting a scientific attitude takes guts, but it strengthens both our command of knowledge and our connection with colleagues. In the end, evidence-based medicine isn't just about better patient outcomes. It's also a powerful antidote to burnout. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this post. In upcoming episodes, we'll be addressing where to look to actually acquire and, more importantly, maintain our medical knowledge without being overwhelmed. We'll also talk about ChatGPT and LLMs, large language models, as an extension rather than replacement for what we do. And we'll dive into how you can be creative when it comes to dealing with medical technology options. We'll see you soon.